Hello, everyone. I am Vriti Advani. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. I would like to give a brief intro of our honored speaker today. We are really honored to have you, ma'am. We have with us Miss Emily, who is an associate professor of marketing and behavioral scientist at Cornell University's SC Johnson College of Business. She teaches marketing management as well as brand management at the MBA level. She has earned her PhD in marketing from Stanford University's Graduate School of Business in 2015. And in such a short at such a young age, she's already a Product Development Management Association Consortium faculty fellow, and recently she also won a JCP Best Paper Award. We are really honored to have you, ma'am. On behalf of IMB's marketing for area and Center for Capital Markets, we welcome you. And for the participants, please note that this is an interactive session and Miss Emily will take the questions towards the end of the session. So you can keep typing your questions in the chat Q&A panel or raise your hand for the same. Thank you. So without further ado, let's hear from Miss Emily. The session is all yours, ma'am.
All right, great. Thank you so much for having me. And I assume you can see my screen and it's shared and everything. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. So I've been looking forward to this presentation all semester, and in thinking about what I wanted to share with you today, I'm actually going to talk about two of my projects. So the first project that I'm going to discuss is joint work with Joe Gladstone and Melanie Rudd, and we're looking at downstream consequences of monitoring how much savings you have. And then the second project that I want to present is a project on financial mindfulness. And this is one of my newer projects, and this is actually going to be the first time that I've presented this work to any audience. And so I would love to get your questions and feedback on this work in progress on financial mindfulness. Okay, so the first project, let's dive in. And as promised, I will leave time for questions at the end of the presentation. So in this first project with Joe Gladstone, who's at CU Boulder, and Melanie Rudd, who's at the University of Houston, we were really interested in financial monitoring behaviors. And to start off the discussion of this particular project, I did have some questions that I wanted to ask the audience. You don't have to say these answers out loud, but you can just think about the answer to yourself. So the first question that I want to ask you all is, how frequently do you check how much money you have available in your primary bank account? So is this something that you do on a daily basis? Is this something that you do at least once a week? Is this something that you do at least once a month, or even less than that? Okay. The second question that I want to ask you is, how much money do you have available in your primary checking account right now, if I were to ask you? And would you know this amount within $10, $50, $100, or even more? And so just in thinking about these questions, one of the things that my co-authors and I were really interested in is that there's a lot of variance in how frequently people engage in these types of behaviors. So if we look at data specifically from the US, although we see similar patterns in other parts of the world, we see that Americans specifically, about a third of them check their bank account every day. So they're constantly monitoring their liquid wealth and how much money they have available at that point in time. Whereas another third check it weekly. So once a week, they log into their bank account. And then the remaining people tend to check their bank account on a monthly basis, or sometimes even less than that. And so this is what we're referring to, at least in this paper, when I talk about financial monitoring. So when I use the term throughout this presentation, what I'm talking about is both the frequency with which one checks how much money is available in their personal bank account, as well as their knowledge of how much money they have in these accounts. And as you can imagine, frequency and knowledge are both very highly correlated. So one sort of impacts the other. And so when I say that people vary in the degree to which they monitor their personal checking and savings accounts, I want to be very specific. In this project, we're looking specifically at how often consumers monitor their bank accounts. So we're not looking at things like investors and how frequently they're checking the stock market and how well their investments are doing. We're talking strictly about how frequently are people logging into their bank account and seeing how much money they have available at their immediate disposal. Okay. And so what's interesting about this, or at least what we think is really interesting about this, is that past research suggests that financial monitoring is a good thing. It's something that you should be doing. You should have an awareness of how much money you have available at any given point in time, especially in liquid, in case you encounter some sort of financial emergency. And so research from several different domains actually suggests that there should be a positive relationship between financial monitoring and one's well-being. So if we look at the goals literature specifically, monitoring is something that's frequently considered to be this critical step in the process of self-regulation. So it's considered a key antecedent. And it's also been noted as a behavior that helps people attain goals that they set for themselves. If we look at the information avoidance literature, so sort of the opposite of financial monitoring, people that don't monitor at all, what this literature shows is that avoiding useful information can deprive people of feedback that could be really important for them to fine-tune or improve their subsequent behavior. And we also know that information avoidance, more generally speaking, licenses people to be selfish, which is something that's negatively correlated with well-being. And if we look specifically at the behavioral finance literature, what we know is that monitoring is associated with better budgeting. So this is considered a positive financial behavior. And a field experiment that was done where they actually endowed people with debit cards versus not, so an experiment randomly assigned, found that when they gave people debit cards, they monitored their bank account more frequently, and that subsequently increased the amount of trust that people had in the banking institution. Okay. So lots of different streams to suggest that financial monitoring is a good thing. It's something that we should be doing. And if we look just at the general availability of apps or products that are available to help consumers, we see tons of these budgeting apps that are readily available. And just the sheer availability of these products suggests, at least to us, that this is something that people should be doing, right? Having an awareness of how much money you have across your various bank accounts in your liquid wealth. And so the question that my co-authors and I wanted to pose in this particular paper is this true? Right? Is more frequent financial monitoring always a beneficial behavior? And if so, does this hold for all types of consumer segments? And so as you can imagine, the answer that we find is it depends. And more specifically, it depends on the level of liquid wealth that you have available. Okay. So why is this the case, or why do we think this is the case? So Steph Tully and Isha Sharma have a paper that was just published this year where they look at different inputs into people's subjective perceptions of their wealth. And in this paper, they propose that there's 3 different routes to influencing how wealthy someone feels. And for this particular project, the 2 routes that we wanted to focus on, or that we think are the most important for this project, are the comparative route and the self-perception route. So what does this mean? So the comparative route is about reference points. And so what this would suggest is that frequently checking or frequently monitoring your bank account should make your liquid wealth salient. And if you don't have a very high level of liquid wealth, this is going to make you feel like you're not doing as well as you would like to be doing, and it's ultimately going to affect your well-being in a negative way. The self-perception route talks about judgments that people form about themselves. And so what this route suggests is that frequently monitoring your bank account is going to help you form a perception about your financial self. And if you're frequently checking this account, and once again, your level of liquid wealth is not where you expect it to be, this is going to suggest that you're not as financially responsible as you once thought you were, ultimately making you feel worse about yourself, which could be detrimental to your well-being as a whole. And so in this particular paper, we remain agnostic as to which of these two routes is operating, but both of them sort of suggest a similar pattern, which is if you're constantly monitoring your liquid wealth, and your liquid wealth is at a relatively high level, then this behavior should be beneficial. It should result in a boost to your financial and subjective well-being. Whereas if you're constantly monitoring your liquid wealth and it's relatively low, what we suggest in this particular paper is that this could ultimately backfire and make you feel financially worse off, which could be detrimental to your subjective well-being as a whole. And so when we look at these dependent variables, I want to be clear about the types of downstream consequences that we're looking at and how we're defining well-being. So when we talk about financial well-being in this paper, we're relying on this definition that was used by this group of co-authors here in this paper that was published in JCR in 2018. And in this paper, these authors try to unpack what financial well-being means. And so in this particular paper, we're looking at people's absolute levels of financial well-being, so not relative to how their peers are doing. And in this paper, they look at two dimensions of financial well-being, and we focus particularly on this first dimension of current money management stress. So we're looking at the amount of stress that people are experiencing about their finances and how frequently they worry about their current financial situation. So in this paper, we rely on a lot of large-scale secondary data sets in order to test whether or not this relationship actually exists. One thing I do want to highlight is that we did attempt to do a pre-registered experiment where we randomly assigned people to check their bank accounts right at that moment versus not, and then we assess their financial and subjective well-being. I'm not going to talk about this experiment in detail today, mostly because in this particular experiment, this was sort of a one-shot intervention where we had people check versus not. And so it's not really tapping into the phenomenon that we're attempting to get at in this paper, which is where we're looking at frequency and constant monitoring and monitoring longitudinally. And so one of the things that we're trying to do with this particular paper, obviously work in progress, is collaborate with a bank and see if we can encourage them to send out push notifications to encourage people to check versus not, because we think that this longitudinal perspective is really where we see these relationships start to emerge over time. And I do have a longitudinal study in study 5 that I'm going to show you and I'm going to talk about today. Okay. But sort of at a high level, so study 1, what's the first thing that we were looking at? In this study, we looked at secondary data from a large-scale survey that was conducted by the BBC. And in this particular data set, they had measures that we felt tapped into this construct of financial monitoring. So in this survey, they asked people, for example, how often they check how much money they have available, how accurately they know how much money they have in their current account, and how often they normally check how much money they have in their bank account. So we use these measures to assess their financial monitoring tendencies. In this data set, we also have access to liquid wealth. So savings was reported as a categorical variable. And then we also had measures around people's financial well-being. So in this survey, they were asked, for example, how optimistic they were about their financial future, their level of anxiety about keeping up with paying their bills, and how much of a problem it was for them to do so. And then, of course, we had several covariates that we included when we tested for these various relationships. And what we found in this data set is this interesting crossover effect, such that at higher levels of liquid wealth, we see this predicted relationship between monitoring and well-being, such that people that self-report that they monitor their liquid wealth more frequently have higher financial well-being than people who monitor less frequently. But at lower ends of liquid wealth, we see the exact opposite pattern. So more specifically, for people that had $11,000 or below, what we see is that high account monitoring is associated with less financial well-being than low account monitoring. Right? So put differently, the ones that are checking their bank account less frequently are actually scoring higher on this well-being measure that we have in this particular data set. Okay. We also tested these exact same relationships with a Dutch panel survey, just to see if this replicated in another country, and we get the exact same crossover effect that we see in study 1. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about study 2 in detail, but I am going to tell you a bit more about study 3. Right, so in study 3, we actually collaborated with a retail bank in the UK. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do this is because in the survey measures that we're using, people are self-reporting how frequently they're monitoring their bank account. And in working with this retail bank in the UK, we were able to obtain data to see more objectively how often they're logging into their bank account and actually interacting with the various means that the bank has available to view your liquid wealth. And so the bank provided us with participants' consent, of course, with various measures of how frequently people monitored their finances. And to be a bit more specific about the types of behaviors that the bank allowed us to view, they gave us information over the course of 12 months. We knew how often these customers engaged in mobile transfers, how often they logged into their ATM or took money from their ATM, how frequently they logged into their bank account online, right? So they could see their balance when they do so, how frequently they visited their local branch, and how frequently they called the bank. And as you can see from this graph here, the 2 behaviors that people do most frequently are use an ATM and log into their bank account online. But because we had access to all of these behaviors, we used all of them in our analyses and summed them for each participant. We also, of course, had access to participants' liquid wealth. So this was also something that the bank gave to us. So we used their average balance of their checking and savings accounts. And then the bank also allowed us to administer a survey to people who agreed to have their survey responses matched with their bank account data from the previous 12 months. And embedded in this survey, we asked questions about their financial well-being. So we asked them how often they lose sleep worrying about money, how confident they are in their ability to handle a financial emergency or an unexpected expense, and their level of satisfaction with their financial situation. And then, of course, we also included sort of the standard covariates that one might expect. So what did we see in this data? So in this bank account data, we see the exact same crossover pattern that we observed in studies 1 and 2. I will note that it's not significant at the upper ends of liquid wealth, but we do see the pattern trending in the expected direction. And then at lower levels of liquid wealth, we see the same negative relationship, such that people who monitor their accounts more frequently actually experience lower levels of financial well-being than people who monitor their bank accounts less frequently. And importantly, this negative crossover was observed for more than half of the participants in the sample. Okay. In studies 4 and 5, this is where we extended the scope of the project to look both at financial well-being and subjective well-being, or general life satisfaction. In study 4, we just to give you an overview of the results, we find the same pattern with subjective well-being that we do with financial well-being. And so also in the interest of time, I want to talk about study 5 in detail because we see the exact same patterns that we do in study 4, but this is a bit of a richer data set because it's a longitudinal design. So in study 5, we relied on another publicly available survey from the UK. And the reason that we chose this particular survey is because it's a survey that's administered every 2 years. And it contained all of the measures of the key constructs that we were interested in. So we had financial well-being measures that I'll show you in a minute, subjective well-being, financial monitoring, and liquid wealth. And we had them at several time points. So you can see all of these were in wave 1, and then I have indicated here where they appeared in the subsequent waves that happened every 2 years. So in this survey, titled the Wealth and Assets Survey, you can see some examples here, financial monitoring. So we, of course, had self-reports of how accurately they know the balance of their primary bank account, how often they normally check it. We had liquid wealth measures, financial well-being, once again, thinking about their general financial position, how well they're keeping up with their bills and credit commitments. And then subjective well-being, we use these measures that tap into life satisfaction, general happiness, and general anxiety. Okay. So if we first look at these pooled models, so if we take all of the data that we have across all of these 7 waves and average everything together, in these models, we see the exact same pattern that we see in all of our previous studies. So we get this crossover effect such that at higher levels of liquid wealth, we see that high account monitoring is associated with greater well-being than low account monitoring. Exact opposite pattern at lower levels of liquid wealth. Okay. We see the exact same pattern, this crossover effect, when we look at subjective well-being. So what's happening with people's general happiness and life satisfaction. And then one of the things that we were really excited to do with this particular data set is because it's longitudinal, we were able to do these within-person analyses. And so we were looking at these within-person effects, and more specifically, these interactions between liquid wealth and financial monitoring. And what you can see here in this graph is that within the same person, we see that as their liquid wealth changes over time, so does their level of financial well-being, such that at higher levels of liquid wealth, right, we can see that there's this positive relationship between financial monitoring and financial well-being, whereas at lower levels of liquid wealth, we see this negative relationship between financial monitoring and financial well-being. So at least trying to get us a bit closer to the causal relationship or the causal claim that we're trying to make. And lastly, another thing that we looked at with this particular data set is we ran a longitudinal moderated mediation analysis. So we looked at frequency of account monitoring and liquid wealth at time 2, how that affects account monitoring and liquid wealth at time 1, how that affects financial well-being at time 2, and then in turn, how that influences subjective well-being at time 3. And so what we find with this particular analysis is that liquid wealth moderates the effect of account monitoring on financial well-being, and then this subsequently has a downstream effect on subjective well-being or life satisfaction. Okay, so what's the key takeaway? Well, one of the things that we're trying to show in this paper is that financial monitoring, while many people think this is a good thing and this is a positive behavior in which we should be engaging, that this may not be as psychologically beneficial as we think it is particularly for people that have lower levels of liquid wealth. And so what does this mean for people that advertise or promote these financial apps? And I want to be clear, we're not trying to say that people with low levels of liquid wealth shouldn't monitor their bank accounts at all. What we're trying to do in this particular paper is just shed light on the fact that there might be some unexpected downstream consequences to doing these particular things, and just being aware of your financial state, particularly if it's not something that you are as happy with at that particular moment. And so I think this sort of segues very nicely into the second project that I'm working on, which is on financial mindfulness. Because we view this as a potential solution to help people with lower levels of liquid wealth not overreact when they're constantly monitoring their finances. Okay. So in this second project on financial mindfulness, why should we study this? A few reasons. So as we know, Americans and people all over the world find finances to be very stressful. So people constantly rank money management as one of their #1 stressors in life. And what ends up happening is that when people are stressed about their finances, they do things like avoid checking them altogether, or they tend to overreact and respond negatively or over emotionally when their financial situation isn't where they would like it to be, which is exactly what we're observing in this first project that I talk about. And so in this project, we're trying to think about how can we leverage findings from mindfulness and apply it specifically to the domain of personal finance to help people respond better, or at least more appropriately, when their financial situation is not as good as they hoped it would be. And so just to be clear, financial mindfulness isn't a new term that we're coining. This is something that we see in industry quite frequently. And so I tried to do a screenshot of all of the places where you see things like financial mindfulness or money mindfulness. And so there's books, there's apps, there's journals, there's businesses that name that try to leverage the positive brand associations with mindfulness. But what's interesting about this is that there doesn't appear to be a standard definition of what financial mindfulness is. And if anything, what a lot of these businesses or financial products refer to as mindfulness is synonymous with budgeting, right? So when these businesses are talking about financial mindfulness, they're talking about better budgeting behavior. Okay? And so we wanted to sort of unpack what financial mindfulness means. It can't be that it's synonymous with budgeting. What else does this construct entail? And so what we did to sort of gain a better understanding into the meaning of financial mindfulness is we engaged in these 10 depth interviews. So we relied on convenient sampling and also our social networks to identify 10 participants across a variety of life stages. And we also tried, thanks to Zoom, to talk to people all over the country and have these conversations about what financial stressors are they currently experiencing, how do they cope with these stressors, and perhaps most importantly, if they had to define financial mindfulness, what would that mean to them? And so you can see sort of a summary of the types of people that we talked to when we conducted these depth interviews. And it was really important to us to get people at all stages of life. So people, for instance, who just graduated from college, maybe they're experiencing some debt, they have to pay off their student loans, uncertainty surrounding their careers, people sort of in their late 20s, early 30s, late 30s. So parents, right? What's the stress that comes with having to send your kid to college? And then also people that are thinking about retirement. So sort of in that stage of life, what stress do they experience when they have to make sure that they have enough money set aside for their financial future? And so as part of these interviews, we of course asked people to define what financial mindfulness means to them. And we got a nice variety of responses, but also a lot of responses that sort of honed in on these two key components. And so this first component that a lot of people mentioned had to do with their awareness of their current financial state. So you can see here, I took some snippets of what people said. So they talked about being aware of how they're doing financially, being aware of how much money they're making, being aware of their savings, being aware of their spending. So this convergence here on awareness of what your personal financial situation looks like at that particular moment. But then we also had people talking about this second component that had to do more with acceptance. So talking about, yes, it's important to be aware of how much money you have, but it's also important not to stress out too much. Or it's also important not to worry about your financial future or worry about things that may be outside of your control or worry about things that happened to you in the past. And so taking these interviews together, we define in this particular project financial mindfulness as this tendency to be both aware of your current financial situation, but also to possess this acceptance or this non-judgmental acceptance of how you're doing at that particular moment. Right. And so one of the things that we aim to do in this particular paper is to create a scale to measure how financially mindful people feel. And then we want to be able to use this scale to predict subsequent financial behaviors. And so we're at a point in the project where we have developed the scale. So I'll show you the exact items that we came up with. And we're sort of in this fun stage where now we get to think about how to use the scale to try to predict money management behaviors in which people engage. So just to give a brief overview, what are some of the things that we did? So we created a bank of 30 items to try to tap into these two dimensions of awareness and acceptance when it comes to your personal finances. And then through item purification, we narrowed the set down to 8 items. So we have 4 that tap into awareness and 4 that tap into acceptance. We also did a confirmatory factor analysis to ensure that these do load onto 2 separate factors. Okay, in terms of the awareness items, these are the 4 items that we ended up using in our scale. So you can see here, when I want to buy something, I know exactly how much money I have available to spend. My personal money management philosophy is knowledge is power. I am very attentive to my personal finances. I know almost exactly the total amount of money I have across my bank and investment accounts. Okay, our 4 acceptance items, I cannot look at my credit or debit card statements without having my emotions take over. If my bank account balance is not where I want it to be, I find it difficult to focus on anything else. I wish I could more easily control my emotions toward my personal finances. And when something changes in my financial life, I frequently react irrationally or inappropriately. So these items that are tapping into people's emotional regulation when it comes to their current financial state. Another thing that I wanted to show you is that awareness and acceptance, so these 2 dimensions are positively correlated, but they're not correlated as highly as one might expect. So you can see here the Pearson R is 0.18. Okay. So we're in the process of doing retest reliability. And we're also in the process of doing all of our discriminant validity checks. So this is actually a study that's currently running in the behavioral lab at Cornell right now. So since data collection hasn't finished, that's why I'm not presenting that data, because I don't have it yet. But what I am going to present is these scale correlations with various behaviors, right? So another thing that we ended up doing was we wanted to see sort of what financially mindful people do, or at least what consumers think financially mindful people do. And so in this study that we just ran last week, we looked at 60 different behaviors, and we asked participants on Prolific Academic to imagine someone who does insert behavior. So you can see here someone who tracks their income and expenses every month. And we ask them to indicate how aware this person is of their financial situation, as well as how accepting this person is of their financial situation. We looked at a bunch of different behaviors, most of them financial behaviors. So we looked at things like savings behavior, planning behavior, minimizing debt, managing general cash flow, investing, managing retirement savings specifically. And then we also looked at a few non-financial behaviors, such as subjective well-being or financial harmony, which is how frequently people fight with their partner about money. And so the first thing that we did was we just created a scatter plot of where these 60 behaviors fell on these two dimensions. And we were interested to see actually that there weren't any behaviors that fell in this upper left-hand corner. So no behaviors that we identified in this set were behaviors that people felt constituted low awareness but high acceptance. And so what this suggests, at least to us, is that awareness is actually something that comes before acceptance. So put another way, it's really hard to be accepting of your current financial state if you're not aware of what that state actually is. And so just to give you an idea of some of the key behaviors that we found associated in the other three quadrants. So if we look at people that participants think have low awareness and low acceptance, these are people that these are people that do things like exceed their monthly credit card limit. So these are sort of the ostriches, if you think about them, right? They don't want to know what their financial situation is, and so they're just going to spend money aimlessly without this awareness of how much they actually have to spend. In terms of high awareness and low acceptance, what do these people tend to do? So these are the people that tend to stress about things that they can't always control, like the ups and downs of the stock market. And people that have high awareness and high acceptance are the ones that are doing these positive financial behaviors. So these are the ones that are doing things like contributing the maximum amount to their retirement plan. And one of the things that we think is really interesting about this is that if you think about or look at most financial products that are available, a lot of them focus on this awareness component. So all of the budgeting apps that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, right, they're talking about heightening your awareness, but not necessarily your acceptance of your current financial state. And so one of the things that we're thinking about in this project is how do we boost this second dimension? How do we increase people's acceptance of their current financial state so that they can respond appropriately and move on in a way that's beneficial to their future financial well-being and financial situation? And so one of the things that we're doing as part of this project, and this is something that I would love to get your feedback on, is we're partnering with this fintech app that's in beta, so it hasn't entered the market yet. It's going to come out in a couple of months. And the name of this app is called Aura, and it's designed as a mindful money management platform. So you can see some of their mock-up of their promotional material here is talking about putting your money to work and anxiety to rest. And so one of the things that we're envisioning for this scale that we created is you can see here in these mock-ups of what the app will look like. They want to do things like administer existing scales to their customers to get a sense of their psychological profile. And so you can see here, they want to do things like ask users of the app to fill out, this is the tightwad spend for a scale. So they would have them do things like complete these existing scales, and then they would give them feedback on their score, what this means about the way they manage their finances, and ask whether or not this is something they agree with. And so we're envisioning that our scale is something that would also be put on this platform so that we would have these financial mindfulness measures of these users. Other things that they want to do on this app is they want to give quizzes to assess people's financial knowledge. So we think it would be really interesting to see, for example, if the first dimension of awareness is correlated with their level of financial knowledge. But they also, different from other apps, want to facilitate this community or these interactions with others. And so we want to look at things like how frequently are people posting? How frequently are they talking to other people? Does this interact with our awareness dimension? Does it help boost both dimensions, right? Will this actually shift people's level of financial mindfulness? And then lastly, what the app aims to do is compile these portfolios of their users. So we'll know, for example, their level of risk tolerance when it comes to their finances, the various vehicles they'll have for engaging in retirement savings, their current income, their net worth. And so we think it would be interesting to look at a bunch of these objective financial measures and see how they correlate with our scale. And then they also assess money personalities. So how do they feel when it comes to managing their finances? And so we want to see how that will interact with our financial mindfulness scale as well. And so for that, the question that I sort of have for all of you, and happy, of course, to answer the other questions that bubbled up throughout this talk, but just thinking more generally, when it comes to financial mindfulness, what other behaviors should we look at both within this app as well as outside the app, right? Because we want to make sure that this affects other types of behaviors, not just in the fintech platform, but how else can we leverage this understanding of this construct of financial mindfulness to help people make better decisions? Okay, and so I think with that, I will open it up for questions. So I think I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see more people. Okay.
Hi.
Hello, Mansi, you want to say something?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, Mansi, go ahead.
Yeah. So thank you, Emily, for such a nice presentation. It's really interesting. And so I have a few questions. So may I?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So I saw that you were saying that in the first of your project that you looked up at that people, those who are at the low level, they have low liquid wealth, they monitor, if they monitor less frequently, their financial well-being is high.
Yep.
So why this is happening?
Yeah, so there's a few reasons that we propose in the paper, but we didn't actually test any of the mechanisms in the project itself. So we think it could be just about the general judgments that people are forming about themselves and their level of financial responsibility. So I have another paper where I find that people think they're more financially responsible than they actually are. And so a lot of times people walk around thinking, you know, I'm doing okay when it comes to my finances, but then when I check my bank account and the number is maybe lower than I expected it would be, this sort of has a negative effect on their emotions and overall well-being. It could be just about expectation disconfirmation and negative effects of that. So to answer your question, we think it's multiply determined, and we didn't hone in on a particular mechanism, but just about these, we think it has to do with these subjective judgments that people are forming about themselves and their financial ability in the moment being anchored on their level of liquid wealth.
If I may say so, is it because of insecurity also? Because when we have high bank balance, we become insecure, and that's why we want to check it again and again. Maybe something like that.
Yeah, so it could be about general insecurity. But I almost feel like I would expect people to be more insecure if they check it again and again and it's lower than they think it might be. but there could be some level at which this pans out. I know, for example, when I check my bank account balance and I have too much in there, then I feel bad that I'm not investing because I have money that's just sitting there and not accruing any interest. So yeah, it could be. To be clear, it's an unanswered question, but it is something that I think we would like to look at in future research, and especially we're trying to collaborate with a bank to do a field experiment on this, and this is where we're hoping to test several different mechanisms.
Okay. And one more thing, if I may ask. And then in the second study, you talked about mindfulness. So, and how can we relate it to account monitoring?
Yeah, so I think we view the first dimension, awareness, to be related to account monitoring or financial monitoring, whereas the second dimension is something separate. So it's about how I feel about my general financial situation.
Okay, thank you. And about your question, so a few things that I think you can talk about is, can you talk about subjective well-being and financial well-being in your app also? That what is their status before they enter the app, and after few transactions with the app, or after engagement, what is their well-being?
Yeah, I actually like that. And one thing that's really unique about this opportunity is when I've collaborated with apps in the past, they've been existing apps, but something that's an advantage to this app is that it hasn't been released yet. So we'll be able to get these baseline measures that I haven't been able to get with other companies that I've collaborated with. So I'm really excited about that.
Okay, thank you. Great.
All right, thank you.
So few questions are on chat. So
Oh, I love how people were indicating how frequently they monitor. Okay, so to answer this question in the chat, don't you think financial well-being is actually a small component of one's overall subjective well-being? So that's a great point, and that's something that I should have mentioned. So perhaps unsurprisingly, we find much smaller effect sizes when we look at subjective well-being than when we look at financial well-being. That said, research has shown that how people feel about their financial state does bleed into their general happiness and their life satisfaction, particularly if I'm stressed about my finances or paying my bills, that's going to affect my general day-to-day happiness. But I completely agree with you that there's lots of inputs into people's general life satisfaction and subjective well-being. So things like how happy am I in my relationship? Things of this, like, am I happy with my job? Job satisfaction bleeds into subjective well-being. So there are a lot of inputs into subjective well-being, but we were excited to find, even if it's a small link, that link to financial well-being does spill over to affect subjective well-being, even if it is a smaller effect size.
There is a question in Q&A panel also. According to study awareness and acceptance, has a Pearson correlation of 0.18. Since awareness precedes acceptance, can we say people who are aware accept their current financial state 18% of the time? What can we infer from this?
Hang on, I just want to read it. Yeah, so I guess that's not how I interpret the Pearson R. So I just interpret it as like meaning that these are two things that are related, but they are distinct. And so just looking at the scatter plot, right, we can see people sort of in all quadrants. So yeah, I will ask my co-author Simon if like that's one way we can interpret it, but I interpret it more as the association between the two constructs, whereas before we started this particular project, I would have thought these two things would have been much more highly correlated. So I was surprised that we consistently get Pearson R's of less than 0.2. Okay. Oh, great question. So what do you mean by promoting acceptance? Is it emotional in nature, or is it cognitive, or are you looking at holistic acceptance? So that's a great question. I agree that we need to probably tease that construct out a bit more. The way I've been thinking of it, and the way at least 3 of our 4 items think about it that we got from our item purification, is I tend to think of it as more emotional in nature. So regulating your emotional response so that you're not overreacting to things. And I guess I construe this as your emotions then influencing your cognitive response. But I completely agree with you that I think we need to do a better job at unpacking what acceptance means. So yeah, that's great feedback. How do you think one's health impacts their financial well-being? Oh, interesting question. So the relationship between physical health and financial health. I can only speculate at this point. I will say, or maybe I'm not allowed to say this. So I was asked to review a paper recently where they were looking at relationships between physical health and financial health, because this is something that I do think there could be more work on the relationships between these various health domains. So, you know, in one sense, when we think about self-control more generally, right, my general level of self-control can affect my physical health as well as my financial health. And so I do think that there is a relationship there such that self-control in one domain can probably spill over and affect self-control in another. But I also feel like there may be people who are have a high level of self-control when it comes to their finances, and then maybe that licenses them to indulge and things like overeating when it comes to their physical health. So I guess to answer the question, I don't have any data to speak to this. I imagine that they are correlated, and that people that have higher financial well-being are probably physically healthier. But I do think that more work maybe needs to be done in this domain. We tend to look at these things in buckets, and I think it's interesting to look at health more generally, right? Physical health, mental health, financial health. What are the relationships between all of these things? I know it's really late your time, so I apologize that so yeah, I know it's close to 10 p.m. your time on a Friday, and I'm sure you've been working hard all week. So thanks so much for these great questions.
So, participants, do you have any question? Otherwise,
Yes, there is one more question in the Q&A, ma'am, if you can see. Is there any chance of reverse causality, as in people who are high on subjective well-being will monitor their account less?
Yeah, so that's also a great question. So of course, reverse causality could be an issue in 4 of the 5 studies I presented. That's why we were really happy to get access to the longitudinal study, where we were able to look at these findings within subject. But I will say it's not something that we're able to completely rule out with our data, and that's why sort of running a large scale experiment where we're randomly assigning people to frequently monitor versus not is something that is sort of on our eventual to-do list. And we considered running this sort of as something that we could do on MTurk or on Prolific Academic, but I think we're just worried that there's no way to check whether or not people are actually doing these things that we're assigning them to do. And so that's why we're trying to collaborate with a company so that we can verify adherence to these behaviors and sort of weed out people that didn't monitor when they were asked to.
Okay. So do we have any more questions? I think then that's it. Thank you so much, Emily, for your time. It was really insightful, and the point that you said that we should not overreact about our liquid financial health and stay mindful and still calm. That was a great advice and takeaway for for everyone, I think. Thank you so much.
All right,
Thanks.
great. Well, thank you so much for attending. And if you have any other questions or anything pops up, feel free to send me an email.
Thank you, Emily. Hope to meet you soon in ACR or SCP.
Oh, are you going to SCP?
Yeah.
Okay, then let's definitely meet up. I will definitely be in Puerto Rico. So
Yeah.
really excited about it.
Okay, thanks. Have a nice
All right.
weekend.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.